Welcome, everybody, both in person here on the Irvine campus and wherever you're watching. I'm Jeff Wasserstrom, and this is a pop-up panel on Putin's invasions in a global perspective, a pop-up panel responding to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. It's being put on by the University of California, Irvine's Forum for the Academy and Public Life, the Forum for the Academy and the Public. And we will be going through different perspectives on the war in Ukraine than some of the ones that are getting most coverage in the media. Though we will begin with two representatives of the media who have covered past wars. So starting off, we'll have Katie Stallard, who covered, among other things, the invasion of Crimea in 2014, when she was working for Sky News. She'll be followed by Adam Brookes, a former BBC reporter, broadcaster, who reported from China, Afghanistan, and Iraq during the invasion of Iraq. Following those two presentations that will talk about the coverage of the current invasion vis-a-vis other invasions of the fairly recent past, we'll be going around the world and back in time to look for other kinds of parallels, as well as bringing in how the current events are seen in different parts of the world. And so for that part of it, we will hear from Arewa of Temple Law School, the author of Disrupting Africa. And then from two members of my own department, UCI's history department, Zahong Nguyen, who's a Southeast Asia specialist, and then Felix Jean-Louis III, who is a Haiti specialist. And then finishing things up will be comments by Amy Willans, who is the director of the Forum for the Academy and the Public and a professor of literary journalism here in the English department, and has spanned the journalism academic divide by having both reported from zones of conflict and teaching here at UCI. So without further ado, I think we should just jump right in with first Katie and then Adam talking about this invasion vis-a-vis others. Each participant will speak for about 5 minutes, and then we'll have a lot of time for question and answer among themselves and with questions from the local audience and questions that can come in via Zoom. All right, Katie.
Thanks, Jeff. It's great to join everybody here. I want to start off by just acknowledging the conditions that media are working on the ground in Ukraine now, and that's both the foreign broadcasters that you see so much of on your TVs and in your newspapers, but also the very many Ukrainian journalists, drivers, translators who are working there to facilitate that coverage. You know, making the decision to stay, for instance, in Kyiv or in Kharkiv, knowing what could come, is a courageous act. And I think, journalism is a much maligned trade, but I know nobody in that situation who is doing that and putting themselves at very real risk through anything other than just a real commitment to be there and to witness what's happening and to show people. So I guess that's the perspective and the context that I want my remarks to be seen in. I mean, I think the one thing I would also say right at the top that is so different to last time in 2014 is how much Ukraine has changed. I think this is a really key factor that Putin seems to have misunderstood. And, in 2014, covering the Maidan and the protests in the center of Kyiv, you didn't have to go very far away from that to find people who felt very differently and who genuinely did believe that their democratically elected president, Viktor Yanukovych, had been unfairly overthrown. And when you went, for instance, last time, the culmination of the protests on the Maidan, when we started to get reports that something was happening in Crimea, that these what are now known as little green men were taking over the airport, surrounding some of the Ukrainian military facilities down there, those were Russian soldiers, but there were also local people, there were volunteers. You would meet people who the day before had been a car mechanic, were now coming to stand on the highway, on the entrances into Crimea, to stand against what they thought and believed, having watched their news, was this fascist junta taking control of Kiev. So there was a lot more opposition and just difference of opinion within Ukraine about what is happening than now. And I think, one of the important things to understand is just how long Ukraine has been at war. I think we've often tended not to focus on it here in the West, and we've kind of moved away from it, apart from at points of real crescendo. But Ukraine has been at war now for 8 years. There have been, I think it's more than 14,000 people have died during that time, and it's had a really strong effect on the Ukrainian identity, and it has really shifted. It's shifted how people on the ground see this war, and I think it's shifted in ways that Vladimir Putin hasn't fully understood. If he didn't think that Ukraine was a real country and that people would really fight to defend it, he was wrong. He continues to be wrong, and we are seeing in real time, the bravery and courage of people who are standing against that. But the other thing that I think we're probably not seeing much of right now in our coverage, and I think unfortunately this is going to get worse and get harder, is understanding how this is playing in Russia itself. So during the last conflict, I was based in Moscow, but traveling backwards and forward to Ukraine, and you could still do that. You could go to Kiev, you could drive across the line of contact into Eastern Ukraine and speak to people in the self-proclaimed People's Republic there. So it was easier to get a sense of how the conflict was seen on all sides. And it was really sobering to go back. I was working with a largely Russian team. And when we would go back to Moscow, people in my team would tell their own families about what we'd seen. And, we had seen Russian soldiers, for instance, in Eastern Ukraine, and that, there weren't these fascists and Nazis that had taken over. And people just didn't believe their own children over what they were seeing on the state television news. It was such a dominant shaper of the media environment in Russia. And that has changed somewhat for the younger generation. People have much more access, or they did have much more access to social media and to alternative sources of news on the internet. But particularly for the older generation in Russia, state television news is where they are getting their news. It's where they were getting their news now. And that's going to shape how they view what's happening now. So I think when we see, and we talked before this, I genuinely didn't think that Putin would go ahead with this, because it just seemed so senseless, such an unwinnable conflict, and that it was going to be just so unpopular in Russia itself. It just seemed like an absurd and ridiculous move. But I think we need to understand the way that story is being told in Russia, and that, while there are protests and there are people leaving the country, that doesn't necessarily give you a picture of the wider population and the different reactions people are going to have to this. And it may well be that Putin is able to shape this to some extent, as all, the opinion polling certainly ahead of this conflict suggested, that people do believe this is the West's fault, and that there may be some buy-in to his argument that Russia had no choice but to act. But I think what we're seeing now with Western journalists en masse having to suspend operations, to leave Russia, that kind of much more tactile sense that we were able to get, and being able to just go out and speak to people, to watch the news, to read the newspapers ourselves, we're losing that right now, and quite rapidly. So it's going to become much harder to understand how this is playing in Russia, and how deep and how real the support for Putin is going to be. So let me stop there, because I know we want to keep our remarks short. But I think that's my one key point at the start of this is just to be really understanding how different this looks depending on where you're standing, and depending which media you're consuming when you're watching this conflict unfold.
Great, Adam.
Thanks very much. Thank you. I want to take a really quick look at a few recent invasions elsewhere and just see if there's anything that we can take away from them. And I want to do it through the frame given us by Lawrence Freedman from King's College London, who points out that taking territory is a military act, but occupying territory, holding it and shaping it is a political act. With that in mind, let's just take a very quick look back at Gulf War I. August 1990, Saddam Hussein invades Kuwait. He occupies it, he begins looting it. He makes no serious attempt at building a new political arrangement for Kuwait. He just installs his cousin as governor. 1991, a US-led coalition of enormous proportions assembles in order to retake Kuwait and advance into Iraq to teach the Iraqi military a lesson. 500,000 coalition troops were in that ground force to retake a country that's 100 miles from top to bottom. There was a 5-week air offensive before the ground offensive started to degrade Iraqi infrastructure. When the initial artillery bombardment began, the ground attack into Kuwait, coalition artillery fired 90,000 rounds in 3 hours. That's World War II level artillery bombardment. After 100 hours, Kuwait is retaken. The coalition forces have advanced into Iraq, done enormous damage to the Iraqi army, have turned around and left. No attempt to impose new political arrangements anywhere in this campaign. This, of course, becomes known as the Powell Doctrine. If you want to invade somewhere, have very clear, very attainable objectives, go after those objectives with overwhelming force, and have an exit strategy. Fast forward to 9/11 and Afghanistan. After 9/11, the US-led coalition goes into Afghanistan with a form of hybrid warfare, covert operations, special operations, and airstrikes. And local proxies, of course, to do much of the fighting. Its objectives to destroy Al-Qaeda, regime change, and the rearrangement of Afghan politics into something that is much more favorable to American interests in the war on terrorism. So a deliberate intention to move ahead with that political phase of occupying and shaping a country. The Taliban's toppled rapidly. The coalition moves into its political phase, but this proves much, much more difficult. The political effort mushrooms out into economic reconstruction, into counterinsurgency. At the height of the coalition presence, there are 110,000 coalition troops in Afghanistan, and it takes us 20 years to get out in the face of political and military defeat. Iraq, 2003. A large coalition force assembles, not that large, 177,000 troops, much smaller than Gulf War I at the beginning of the 90s. Objectives. The immediate pretext for the war, of course, weapons of mass destruction is false. The objectives are regime change and larger objectives that are kind of very hard to articulate and nobody really understands. Something to do with building a pro-Western democracy in the Middle East that's going to serve as a sort of beachhead in the region or something like that. Many at the time are skeptical about the objectives. General David Petraeus in 2003 gives us the most enduring line from the whole post 9/11 moment. Tell me how this ends, right? Once again, military operations proceed relatively smoothly, but moving into the political phase of building a new political dispensation for Iraq, the handling of this is done in a way that is little short of disastrous under American leadership. And it takes us, by 2006, Iraq is in a civil war. It takes us 8 years to get the bulk of the coalition forces out. And since then, the country has been racked by terrible episodes of violence and instability. Using this frame, the lesson we take here is that military operations are one thing, but the really hard part is doing political operations in the wake of military operations. What do we kind of take away from these experiences for Ukraine? We have a Russian military force assembled or now in Ukraine of something like 170, 180,000 men. Quite small, considering Ukraine is larger than France. Think back again to Gulf War I, where we had 500,000 troops prepared to take a country that was 100 miles from side to side. The objectives for Ukraine, well, Katie, you'll be able to articulate them better than I can. I don't really know. He seems to want to take Kiev, to control the country's economic and communications nodes, to instigate regime change, and to arrange some sort of new political dispensation for Ukraine, though nobody seems to know what. Russian military does seem to have the power to pummel the Ukrainian resistance into capitulation. I think people here in Washington seem to be kind of agreed on that. It seems to be that it'll probably be a very long, drawn out, and extremely unpleasant process, with the precedents before us of Grozny in Chechnya in the late 90s and of Syria. But then, if we think back to Colin Powell and to Lawrence Friedman, then the hard part starts. Building a new political arrangement that is sustainable in Ukraine. And personally, I find it extremely difficult at the moment to imagine what on earth that might look like. And I look forward to anybody else who might have greater insight than me. And with that, I'll kick it back to you, Jeff.
Great. So now we're going to look at different parts of the world and either how this is being discussed now in those places, but also how history can help, of those places can help us place things into perspective. So first, Funmi, if you would bring Africa into this discussion in whatever way seems right to you.
Yes, I first of all wanted to thank you and Amy for inviting me to participate in this critically important conversation. And I want to say that, ever since I was actually thinking about Ukraine when I first heard about this session, because I was thinking about Ukraine and empires. Because it strikes me, my research in Africa is really about, I do archival research about colonialism. And it strikes me that there's a deeply important story here to tell about the nature of empires, and I think some of the mistakes of empires. So I think part of what I see in Ukraine is a yearning for an imperial past, for past greatness, when Russia was part of the greater Soviet Union and it was a major global power. And that yearning for empire is not only something that we see in Russia. There's often an attempt to curate the past, to look at the past and look at past greatness solely in terms of how great we were in the past, and look at what we were in the past versus what we are today. But the curation process of that abstracts a lot of the pain and suffering connected to the building and sustenance of empires. And I think in abstracting that might be part of what led Putin to make this sort of perplexing move to try to essentially conquer the Ukraine. This was a political act in many respects, trying to accomplish it militarily. And to me, it brings strong parallels to what imperial powers did in African context. In fact, the Kenyan ambassador to the UN had there's a YouTube clip of him floating around where he talks about how Russia is behaving like a 19th century imperial power. And he basically said in African context, we have these false lines that were drawn by colonialists randomly. They sat down at a map and drew lines. And those countries are still pretty much exist in that form today. And he said, we can't really, even though we might have ethnic groups that cut across boundaries, it would be absolute chaos if we decided to then start to redraw boundaries in light of some kind of imperial or other objectives. So I think there's some important parallels in the African experience of empire and the kind of experience of empire in what we're seeing in the Ukraine right now. And I think this issue of curation, the thing that ends up getting curated out of the vision, at least from the Russian perspective, is the pain and suffering and death that has come from building empires. Many, many people die because others want to build an empire or a sphere of influence in another part of the world. And so I think that the resistance that we're seeing in the Ukrainian context is very interesting. And I think it's important to think about resistance in two ways. We're seeing a ferocious internal resistance from within Ukraine. And I think that partly reflects what Katie Stallard talked about, and that they've been at war for a very long time. And they were, in a sense, probably ready for this. And we can see that there's a sort of improvisation. There's a response. There's an ability to not only resist militarily, but they're actually at this point, I think, controlling the information war. about what's being said about the Ukraine. And that today in the technological era, that's a really important thing to win. And we see internal resistance, but we're also seeing a pretty ferocious external resistance. I was reading an article recently where someone said, I don't think anyone could have done more to unify NATO and the EU than Vladimir Putin has done by invading the Ukraine. One of the places that I follow closely is Germany, and the way that Germany has pivoted to now saying we're going to spend billions of dollars on our defense. We're going to actually provide weapons to the Ukraine. And we have the Green Party in Germany saying, well, we really think that we should have nuclear power plants run longer if it means that we're not reliant on Russian energy supply, Russian gas. So I think we're seeing an extraordinary resistance of a kind that I don't think anyone would have predicted 2 or 3 weeks ago. And I think today the United States indicated that it's going to ban Russian energy products. So this is the people externally, this is serious pain. This is not without pain within the United States. If we look at what's happening with gas prices, stock markets, there's a lot of that. The chaos that we're seeing inside the Ukraine is not contained, partly because the response has been a different response than what we saw to the earlier annexation of Crimea. So I think what empire builders often fail to take sufficient account of is resistance, and the fact that people can resist very fiercely in ways that are unpredictable. And ultimately, that's what often makes the kind of empires that are being built here and that have been built in the past, difficult to sustain. I would add that one thing we're seeing here is we're seeing the impact of technology. This is a war that's playing out in full bore of social media. Some people are calling it the TikTok war. So we're seeing all that pain and suffering. I mean, we can see people being bombed. We can see dead bodies. And that's something I think, and they're in Europe, which I think makes a difference. I'm going to end by talking about race a bit. And they're in Europe, which I think many people feel a connectivity in the West, a cultural connectivity in ways they don't feel when we see suffering in many parts of Africa and even in places like Syria. So I think the technology side makes it both disturbing and really some weird, interesting things. Like people were looking at Google Satellite and predicting where the Russian army would be moving because they were looking at amassing tanks using Google Satellite. And I think that a lot of the technology companies have now disabled some of the functionality that might enable at least everyday people to try to predict military movements by using sort of everyday technologies. But I think the empires, resistance, and technology are really, really important stories to pay attention to and to think about in light of the Ukraine. The last but not least, I want to talk about the impact of race, because I think there's been a direct connection with Africa, partly because of the empire building goals here show a lot of synergies with what European colonialists tried to do in Africa, albeit with slightly different impact and different origins. But one thing that's been really fascinating is to see how students from Africa, students from South Asia have been treated who are trying to flee. So one of the things we're seeing the Nigerian ambassador pleading to say, could you please let Nigerian students leave the Ukraine? So the thing that's very interesting is, and this gets to what the goals of the Putin are to begin with, many countries who might actually be supportive of him have people in the Ukraine that are basically being killed. There was an Indian student that was killed in the past week. There are many, many African students in the Ukraine. There are Chinese students in the Ukraine. And these people cannot evacuate. And many Africans, when they get to the border, they're being blocked from evacuating because they're saying only Ukrainians can leave. So that really puts a very difficult situation for people who, it's very difficult for Ukrainian, and it's also for Ukrainian people, it's also very difficult for people who are not Ukrainian. And then I think that should lead us to question, what are the goals here to begin with? Because I think hasn't really been thought out in terms of the broader impact of what Russia's trying to accomplish here. And I think that is reflected if we look at the UN General Assembly vote. There were only 4 countries that voted along with Russia. Almost every other person that might have been a potential ally abstained. And that, I think, that should give us a sense of the global reaction to what we're seeing in Ukraine. I'm going to stop there, and I look forward to our conversation. Thank you.
Wonderful, wonderful. And so now take us to Southeast Asia or Southeast Asian perspectives, because I know you've been paying attention to more than one.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for inviting me here. So I wanted to go back a little bit to what Katie just said earlier on, emphasizing the different opinions on the ground. So I'm also reading various sources on Southeast Asia and particularly Vietnam. And I see like even like the Vietnam War, which ended like almost 15 years ago, we're still talking about different opinions and the different views of Vietnamese, of Americans, of other participants of the war. So even the name of the conflict as well. So with the current situation in Ukraine, when I read other media coverage in Southeast Asia, I see a lot of terms like the armed conflict. And it seems like a lot of people try to avoid the word invasion. Vietnamese coverage, for example, I see multiple times they use the Russia's special military operations in Ukraine, and they try to avoid the word Russian invasion of Ukraine, and that tells us something, right? So basically, the general responses from Southeast Asia has been, I see a lot of critics of their responses, because seems like a lot of Southeast Asian countries remain passive or muted or silent, or their responses been lukewarm, or they keep an ambiguous position in this situation. So it seems like they couldn't find a forceful and unified voice among these ASEAN nations. With the limited economic ties and political engagement of Russia in Southeast Asia, and plus the geographical distance, Russia poses little threat to Southeast Asia. But this situation in Ukraine actually creates a very dangerous precedents, especially for when Southeast Asian countries talk about its big neighbors in the north, an assertive country like China, which has repeatedly expressed its expansionism and pushed for its own interpretation of international law, and it's most clearly in the dispute of the South China Sea. So it is really a concern that I can see very clearly in a lot of media coverage in Southeast Asia. So recently, as we all know about the recent vote at the UN, when 9 of the 11 Southeast Asian countries voted for it, but two countries abstained, which are Vietnam and Laos. So this is really as someone working on Vietnam, I would say that this is something that we have to look at deeply at the situation. So I would say on the ground, the public opinion is quite different than government policy in this case. So I see a lot of people in Vietnam are shocked and horror at the invasion. So I think that I understand why the official response might be to abstain on the UN resolutions, because they're not wanting to risk relation or the trade deals with either with Russia or the West, right, or the Western countries. But so it's probably the only way to claim neutrality moving forward for Vietnam and for Southeast Asia in general as well. Even so recently there's a joint statement of all of the foreign ministers of ASEAN, and it's very disappointed that they didn't even use the word. They didn't even mention Russia in that statement. So there's no reference to Russia here. So people understand that, but there's a lot of personal sympathies with the Ukrainian people. And a lot of people from Vietnam in particular, in fact, have studied in the Eastern Europe, and recently there's 2 flights to rescue Vietnamese in Ukraine back to the country. So Vietnam see the abstain the UN resolution, but in fact it doesn't want to risk the relation with Russia. In fact, Russia is one of the three so-called comprehensive strategic partners with Vietnam. It's been the most important defense partner that provided a lot of weapons and military equipment. I believe it's more than 80% to modernize the Vietnamese military. So even though it expressed grave concerns, but Vietnam refrained from mentioning any countries in its statements. So among the people on the ground, though, the current situation in Ukraine reminded a lot of Vietnamese of a previous war, which is the border conflict between Vietnam and China, and what we call the Chinese invasion of Vietnam in 1979. So back then, people discussed, right, the pretext of these conflicts, and because back then Vietnam and China has been brothers, right? The Communist Alliance, and it also shared a lot of its shared history and significant parts of its culture, similarly, to Russia and Ukraine. And back in 1979, there's various reasons here, and I'm not going into deep details, but China basically wanted to teach Vietnam a lesson. So a big power, right, wanted to teach a small power a lesson, basically, who's the boss in the region, right? So with the current situation in Ukraine, a lot of Vietnamese also fear of what lesson will China draw from this conflict. Because with the current dispute in the South China Sea, and currently this week, China is holding the military exercise in the South China Sea. So if China has been pushed for its own interpretation of international law and seeing what Russia is doing right now, what China will do next in the region, particularly in the South China Sea, is the real main concern that a lot of people on the ground now is talking about. And look forward to more discussions.
Great. Okay, Felix, now let's take us to the American Empire and the Caribbean.
Yeah. Hi. Yeah. I want to add my voice to thank Amy and you, Jeff, for inviting me on this panel. And I think I found a lot of synergy with what I was thinking about with what Dr. Arewa was saying and Zuhan was saying about the experience of people's experience with empire. And I find that the incursion that most mirrors this, in my opinion, is Grenada, and not inherently Iraq or Afghanistan, although there are parallels to be drawn there. For sure, this is the expression of empire. And speaking to Haitians in informal settings, we find multiple opinions of this. As us who have suffered from empire, part of the voices are aghast about the images that we are seeing on television, and others find a level of hypocrisy from a person who has authorized 5 invasions in the past 40 years to so strongly denounce invasion, and not that invasions are ever right and the expression of empire is ever right. But for me, this is a lot of what mirrors kind of what Zuhan was saying about China's 1979 invasion, about a shared history, about the regional power expressing itself in its backyard. And this brings us to the US and the Caribbean around the mid-19th century, where it's starting to express itself in its neighbors to control the various the governments around it. And it makes you think about what is propelling this empire, this move of empire into the Ukraine. And in my opinion, and looking back at US expansion, empire moves for several reasons. One are geopolitical concerns. And I think Vladimir Putin, in expanding into Ukraine, is after the eternal Russian search for warm water ports, having to be able to express itself through its navy very easily. Another reason that empire moves is also for economic reasons. So to be able to get new markets, to be able to affect itself to send out its its material goods that it's making, and all of this. And again, this port works for this. And in fact, the first city captured was Kherson, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, a port city. And I find a lot of the reason that empire moves is sort of, and especially for the US, was this manifest destiny. The idea that it was in charge of spreading itself. And manifest destiny wasn't only a continental aspiration, it was a global aspiration. And I think Putin here is expressing a sense of manifest destiny into its backyard. The larger Russian state is what he's trying to affect, or return to the larger Soviet power here. These are some of the parallels I'm seeing there. And then there's an idea of patriarchy and paternalism, and an expression of masculinity. We know that Putin is himself a person who has shown his manliness throughout time. We often see him without a shirt. And the state itself, but he is a representative of the state. And he is expressing the power of the state in this moment. And for me, this is a reminiscent of Theodore Roosevelt, who at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, sent a fleet of gunboats around the world to announce the arrival of the US power internationally. And I think this also is an announcement to the international arena that you will not put guns in Ukraine. You will not have a military arm around me that can attack me at any time. And I think this is what he's countering, whether or not these are true things, but this is sort of the geopolitical concern that he's trying to affect militarily worldwide. And I think that thinking about the discourse, the propaganda used in Russia to affect sort of a support for the war brings me back to 2013, when everybody knew there were weapons of mass destruction, when everybody knew that Saddam Hussein was a bad person. I had a conversation in 2003 that the Hussein boys would have the Iraqi soccer players kick cement balls, and whoever didn't kick the ball would be shot. And these sort of propaganda stories are being used today in Russia. Same way in the early part of the 20th century when the United States is invading Haiti, they're talking about a backwards people. They're forwarding propaganda that builds support for the invasion of Haiti. And the invasion of Haiti, like the invasion of Ukraine, met a lot of these geopolitical concerns. Germany had a lot of power and influence in Haiti around 1915. German merchants had the ear of presidents, had affected the overthrow of presidents. And this is the time, for those who don't know, where Germany is ascendant and about to go into World War I. And if they got control of Mont Saint-Nicolas, a very important port in Haiti, this would be a geopolitical concern for the US. Just like in 1961-62, Russian bombs in Cuba posed a geopolitical concern for the United States. Same way in 1982-83, when Cuba is helping the Grenadian, socialist Grenadian government shore up its military, build the airport. So the idea of geopolitics, whether real or not, comes to play into why empire flexes, so to speak. And this is all what you see here. So I'll end on that note.
Great, giving us a tour of the horizon. It's great, all over. So Amy.
Sorry.
Gee, I feel like I've been on a cruise around the world, and not a happy one. Partly I'm thinking about this idea of making Russia great again. I'm sure that's been said all over. But you really feel the old man's world, if I can say that. I agree with Felix that it's a patriarchal machismo thing that's happening with Putin also. But our discussion today is sort of about how the old world order, in some cases very old, is still trying to approach the world as if that were still the world order, but it isn't really the world order. And I think this has been happening for a long time. One example we saw of this kind of behavior was the French in precisely Indochina, especially Vietnam, where they tested their old metal as a colonial power and failed. And then the US tested its power there too as a rising superpower in the post-colonial world and also failed. So after that, kind of soft power became the watchword, at least for the Americans. Although before it had abandoned its project in Vietnam, it had helped overthrow the first democratic leader of a Latin American country, Salvador Allende in Chile, on behalf of American business interests there and out of fear of being encircled globally by sympathizers with a socialist or communist world. And anyone who wonders, by the way, whether Zelensky will survive this latest version of the Ukrainian uprising has only to look at Allende's fate at the hands of the Americans, more or less at the hands of the Americans. It's been ruled that he committed suicide. I'll agree, since his children agree with that. But he committed suicide to be a martyr, not because he wanted to die. And these spasms of atavistic violence are disastrous in the places where they're occurring. But now with Putin waving the atomic bomb as if it were his prerogative, they can become disastrous elsewhere. And I think people are becoming very concerned about that. But again, I would stress that it is the narrative of an old man like Trump obsessed with making his country and thus himself great again. And I've been forced to think about Augustus and the duty of the head of state. In his case, he finally became emperor, and his duty, he felt after so many years of death and dying and the distribution of empire and the creation of empire, was the progress and well-being of his people. And he felt, from what I've read, that that was the only way to remain great. And so he had the Pax Romana, but that does not seem to be anyone's interest at this moment. And it's a little strange to have this sudden spasm of war, even though I understand the buildup for it, and I understand the enclosure that Putin must have been feeling all this time and the desire to push away the enemy. But I think he's ignoring the central responsibility while trying to control the information going to his people. He's not paying attention right now to hearts, minds, bellies, pocketbooks. That's because it doesn't fuel his power fantasy and it doesn't fuel his vision for Russia. And I cannot help but broaden this out a little bit and say, I find it astounding that the history of the species is one that further and further is removing power over destiny from the masses of the people like us, and placing it in the hands of very few men. Billions are suffering while people with yachts and bankers and private airplane owners and dacha builders and Bel Air McMansion dwellers, to speak from Southern California, and proprietors of single-family islands are lording it over people like the mother and her two children who we saw curbside in Lindsay Adario's photograph from Irpin. So, you know, it's very, very disturbing. I want to say, as a brief aside, it's not so much Ukrainians that aren't allowing students of color and people of color to leave Ukraine. Polish people don't want to let them into Poland. So let's have a little, understanding of what goes on in these countries about people of color. I wanted to say, I don't know if you all saw it, but it was meaningful to me. There was a cartoon on the internet of Italy, and it said, Italy decides to retake its former empire. And then it was just a picture of all of Europe and the Roman Empire. And I thought, yeah, well, what if they started? What if Putin starts? What will it mean? And what I wanted to ask you now, because I am not the main thing here, and Felix has spoken to my main interest, so I won't talk about that. But I wanted to ask, what is the appropriate response for the West? Are these sanctions, which are very severe, are they appropriate? Is the punishment of the Russian people going to have any desired effect for the West? And where will it go? What about the nuclear option? Is Putin serious, do you think? Is that an option? Have we all decided that when people brandish the nuclear weapon, they are joking, or are they not joking? I know that all my friends are very scared right now. Is that just America kind of propagandizing about it, or is Putin, does he mean what he says? So I wondered if I could throw that out to you, and what you see as, I think one of the reasons everybody's freaked out is not just because Ukrainians look like, quote, us, but because Europe is a small place of many countries all on top of each other. And when we have this domino feeling about one going, then the next one can go and the next one. But what is the future for Europe when Putin moves into the Ukraine, which, as Adam pointed out, he probably will be able to do? So I leave that to you, Jeff, to kind of distribute around.
Yeah, so that's giant questions. Let's start with Katie, not to put you on the spot, but I think it's good to circle back to you. I would just say that actually one thing that I'll just chime in is that I do think this is very, very resonant of old discussions of empire, but I think the idea of reclaiming, of making your country great again, is actually something quite different. I see a lot of echoes of 100 years or so ago, but those were largely new empires flexing their muscles. This is something about wanting to reclaim a past sense of greatness, which is worrisome if one focuses on China, because that's very much the rhetoric from within in China as well. And it's been the rhetoric for quite a long time. Though it was eye-opening for me, as much as I think about China, to have Zahom's comment about the focus being on the South China Sea, whereas the American discussion has been so continually Taiwan, 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 which the lesson of Ukraine for Taiwan, at least one, is how messy and hard fighting for a territory with people on it who are going to be determined to resist are. But the idea of being able to fulfill part of the old man's fantasy with moving into an area that has relatively few of those kinds of images of lives being destroyed can be very tempting to a figure who shares that sense of machismo and of restorationism that is something shared across there. But Katie, would you weigh in on some aspect of Amy's big questions?
Yeah, well, and also I just wanted to come back to this idea of curating the past and this idea of how Putin has really sold and is selling this idea of how great we were. I think one of the things that I've really been focusing on in recent years is the extent to which he's stripped back Russia's history, which in the Gorbachev time, you could talk about some of the horrors of the Stalin era. You could look at the Great Patriotic War, what Russians call the Second World War, in a much more nuanced way. You could look at the horrors, the strategic mistakes. Putin's really stopped all that. And he just, right before he did this, one of the things that happened was liquidating Memorial, the 1989, I think 1987 founded organization, which is devoted to preserving the memory of past repressions and the Stalin era horrors in Russia. He has really made a concerted effort to take out all of the shadow and all of the complexity and really present this very triumphal narrative of a great and glorious Russia, which obviously needs a great and strong leader. And it's right to look at this through the prism of empire, because I think that's how he sees himself. I think he is thinking about which of the czars is he going to be compared to, like where does he fit in Russia's history? And I think there's certainly a geopolitical component to wanting to be able to control all or at least part of Ukraine, but there's also this strong emotional component. When you look at his own writing and his own assertion, which is wholly false, that Russian and Ukrainians are the same people, I think there is this strong emotional historical component to what he's trying to do in terms of the, you know, the kind of czarist notion of gathering in the lands, I think that's what he wants his legacy to be. He wants to be the guy who stood up to the West, who made Russia great again, and who made everybody shake and respect Russia's interests. You know, the one thing I would point out is if he was genuinely interested in making Russia great again, he could have spent, you know, a tiny fraction of the amount of money that's been stolen by him and his close friends on actually, you know, building roads, hospitals, schools, providing a sustainable future for Russians. So he's bringing this kind of 19th century idea of what makes a country great, and neglecting wholly any effort to actually make Russia livable or sustainable, or to give the younger generations there a great future. In terms of I think sanctions, and is he serious about nuclear weapons? I mean, one of the more worrying aspects of this is, what if Putin actually does believe everything that he's saying? Like, what if he genuinely does believe Russians and Ukrainians are the same people? And he genuinely does believe, and, you know, I think on this, you know, you can see why he would think this, that Russia has been ignored, its interests have been run roughshod over, that he's kind of, he's making us all take Russia's security concerns seriously, which he is doing. You know, one note of levity I will inject into this is that I saw a Russian friend talk about how he was reassured. He talked to a Russian analyst about, is Putin serious about using nuclear weapons? And they said to him, look at the size of the table he gets out to meet with his close cabinet colleagues. Does this look like a man who's relaxed about dying in a nuclear war? He's clearly has a strong sense of self-preservation. I think it's a threat, but I don't think it's a threat that you can, you know, I think it's intended to say, don't even think about getting involved. Don't even think about a no-fly zone, because, you know, I'm a nuclear power and I expect to be treated as such. So, you know, I think it's threatening, and I think it's intended to frighten. But the danger is, I think he, you know, to Adam's excellent point about having an end strategy, the problem is right now he doesn't. Like, he can absolutely decimate Ukraine. He can turn cities into Aleppo and Grozny, but he is not going to be able to rule Ukraine. He's not going to be able to govern Ukraine. So it's difficult to see what could amount to a victory for Putin. And so, you know, in a war that he can't win on the ground, how does he push his interests? How does he get something that he can declare a victory? So I think there's going to be a lot more brinkmanship and a lot more, you know, really quite dangerous hours and days still to come.
So Adam from the Beltway, do you want to weigh in on the sanctions as a tool, or how does this is different to have this range of sanctions be so central to the story, right?
Right. I mean, just to build on Katie's excellent point, I mean, what does the guy do when sanctions really are crippling the economy, when they can no longer sell oil and gas, when you can't, the ruble has crashed, you know, you can't do any kind of international transaction, when his army is in terrible shape in Ukraine, when Ukraine is ungovernable, and when he's cornered, what does he do? He's got these incredibly powerful weapons at his command, and not only nuclear weapons, he's got a kind of variety of horrendous weapons that he can use in the run-up to start using smaller tactical nukes if he wanted to. Here's an interesting thought. I mean, the Department of Defense here in Washington was briefing yesterday, I think, that they now assess that 75% of Russia's total military capacity is now engaged in Ukraine, which is extraordinary. They've only got about a quarter of their military capacity engaged elsewhere in Russia now. What does that mean? I mean, if that many Russian troops and that much armor and artillery is engaged in Ukraine, and it's really not going anywhere and it's not doing very well, Putin doesn't have a lot of wiggle room. He hasn't got a strategic reserve. He hasn't got other tools at his command, which in turn means that stuff can escalate real quick. simply because he doesn't have gradations of force and gradations of power that he can turn to. So could one imagine a situation where a cornered, furious Putin with everything falling apart around him needs to do something real drastic, real quick, and he turns to larger and more powerful weapons and maybe to tactical nukes? I think that seems to be kind of one of the outcomes that is in the air here in Washington. On the other hand, as Katie also said, I think there's a significant pushback on that along the lines of, yes, the guy is a survivor and he wants to survive, and he knows very well that if he starts using tactical nukes, especially outside Ukraine, then this is going to be catastrophic, and not only for us, it's going to be catastrophic for him too. The question of how this thing gets de-escalated from here, I think, is one that people don't have great answers to right now, and that seems to be the scariest thing. What is an off-ramp for Putin? How do we make sure that he doesn't end up in a position where he's so cornered and so demented that he turns to a very, very rapid escalation of force and it all goes south? I think people are thinking about that. I think Washington is much engaged on this right now, and I think they understand the stakes really well from what one kind of hears. But who knows what the answer to that is?
I'm also curious to hear from how are there different ways that solidarity with Ukrainians or anger at Putin or criticism are framed from countries that have experienced empire? Is that one way in which the rhetoric is that the expressions of support come? I've been following Myanmar very closely, but Burmese there's a two-part move. Some people in Burma are saying what the junta has been doing to us is very similar to what is just now happening in Ukraine. Why weren't there sanctions? Why weren't there stronger sanctions against the government? Why wasn't there more done by the UN? But at the same time saying, because there's a parallel, we feel incredible solidarity with what's going on with the Ukrainian people. So it's a kind of separating out of criticism of governments, but not getting in the way of expressions of solidarity with the people. And Zahom, you were telling me a little bit about other examples in Southeast Asia, but I'm wondering if that's something, are we seeing that also in Africa and the Caribbean and Latin America, or how is the discourse, how are things playing out in social media or in actions on the ground, even in terms of anti-war protests? Do either of you want to weigh in?
I can just jump in really quick. So I just recently, there's anti-war protests happening in Kuala Lumpur or in Bangkok, or just the recent Sunday, just 2 days ago, right here in Orange County in the Little Saigon area, there's protests by Vietnamese Americans to show their solidarity with the Ukrainian people. As we all know, that there's lots of grassroots efforts to collect, all of the, donations and other things to help the people in Ukraine. And even I know that these also happen on the ground in Southeast Asia as well. Speaking of Vietnam, there's multiple people are now, open their arms to help the Vietnamese people coming back from Ukraine, but also they also got a lot of donation, like money, from people around Vietnam. To support people in Ukraine. And I know that in other countries that happen as well. Taiwan just shipped, their batch of medical things and to send to Ukraine. So I think there's a lot of and protests, and it will continue in the future.
I would just say that I think the response in many African countries has been a bit more mixed. I think you've seen statements like the Kenyan ambassador to the UN that have been strongly supportive or strongly critical of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. I think you've also seen a lot of news about the blocking of people at the border. And you see different people say different people are responsible. Some people are saying it's people on the other side. Some people are saying it's people in Ukraine. There's also been a lot of discussion of Ukraine is recruiting foreign fighters. So I've seen some criticism of that from the perspective of African countries. And there's been a lot of attention to what is the economic fallout of this for many African countries. The vast majority of poor people in the world are in Africa. And this invasion is likely to have has already had a significant impact on not only energy prices, but food prices. Ukraine is a breadbasket that supplies food to a lot of the world. So the economic devastation of this is going to go far beyond the European context within which this war is occurring. And I would just add one comment. I think sanctions, the ferocity of the sanctions tells us, I think, that people are very worried. I think there's a lot of uncertainty about what outcomes we might see here. Hopefully nuclear war wouldn't be one of those outcomes, but I think when this war is very tied, or this conflict is very closely tied to Putin's own conception and his own masculinity, and it's hard to know how that plays out. Especially, I've gotten a bit more worried as we've seen how poorly the Russian military has done so far. I think and this may go back to Katie Stallard's comment about a lot of money that was meant for the military actually ended up probably buying some of the yachts we're seeing that people have confiscated, which means the performance doesn't reflect what the money that's been spent for the military. And that makes me a lot more worried about bad outcomes that might lead to some use of nuclear weapons. Because I think if he feels boxed in, I think that's what everyone's worried about. How do you what is the end game here? I don't think he has one, but if he feels boxed in, it's hard to know. It's very unpredictable, I think, what might happen. So I think that and the impact on countries outside of Europe is also going to be immense, just because of the economic fallout.
But if we can see that it's a problem that he feels boxed in, you don't take an angry lion and box him in. Why are we boxing him in so intently? Why are we bothering to ban Russian petroleum products that are a very small percentage of what we need and want? Why are we flashing that in his face now? I don't mean to appease Vladimir Putin, but really an exit ramp is important when you have nuclear weapons possibly in play. So what is the end game of the sanctions? I don't understand it. Does anyone? Do you, Adam, in Washington?
I mean, I think if you ask that of Washington types, the response you'll get is if you're going to have an exit ramp, you've got to force him onto it. And it's still not clear to me what the exit ramp is going to be, but I think they feel that it's inevitable that this kind of however we want to frame it, this bizarre atavistic power fantasy, neo-imperial effort that he's trying to drag us all into needs to get stopped. It needs to stop, and it needs to de-escalate, and we need to exert pressure on him, stopping well short of confronting him militarily. There is, I think, real fear in Washington of confronting him militarily, and the no-fly zone idea has gone precisely nowhere, obviously, and so it should. And so sanctions are the one thing that he remains very vulnerable to. I mean, he's got now very limited foreign exchange reserves. 2/3 of his foreign exchange reserves no one has access to. Foreign exchange from his oil and gas sales was financing his military. That's now being eroded too. I mean, his capacity is being diminished day by day. The worry, I think, is, as you say, as we just pointed out, that this forces him into a corner. So I think we keep on coming back to this idea of what's the off-ramp. And again, what lessons do other people take from this? I mean, what does China take from this? I'd love to hear people's thoughts on that. In the imperial vein, China, the People's Republic of China, has been trying to recreate the borders of the Qing Empire for as long as the People's Republic of China has been in existence. And it's got most of them. It's got Xinjiang, it's got Tibet, it's got Macau, it's got Hong Kong. The only thing it doesn't have now is Taiwan. And the lessons that China takes from this entire episode, particularly its gauging of how united and effective globalized sanctions against Russia have been, are going to be key to China's strategic formulations in the short to medium term with regard to the South China Sea and to Taiwan. I think we can see that. I think we can make that assumption anyway. What those assumptions will be on China's part, I don't think we're going to know for a long time. They make their decisions very slowly, and it'll take a lot of analysts with great Chinese in the West to figure out over months and months and months what lessons China's taking away from this. But yes, I mean, absolutely, to echo your points, yeah, this bleeds outwards. I mean, everybody's equations change, and we don't yet know how, and we're not going to know until we've got an end game and what that off ramp is.
And another problem is you cannot use Russia in its current aspect as a lesson for China. You can't just say, okay, we're going to teach China a future lesson by doing this to Vladimir Putin, because you have to deal with the Russian situation. It's not just an interesting thing, and that's a problem. Felix?
Yeah, well, I think that there is a lesson being told to China. The global response to Russia is this lesson. If you remember, in 2003, the United States invasion of Iraq was a very unpopular thing in the world. But yet all we did here, the only thing we had to do is learn how to say we're eating freedom fries, right? And instead, now the world, and many of these corporations have brought the US power to bear onto Russia, which kind of what everybody's been speaking about here is a dangerous thing. We have to remember Putin comes to power after a humiliated Russia, and at least from what I read, this is how he appreciates it. You know, we had sort of Boris Yeltsin, who was the butt of a lot of jokes after the fall of the Soviet Empire, who preceded him, and his manifesto sort of in 1999 sort of asserts sort of this stark Russian nationalism. So if he's embarrassed here in Ukraine, as we've suggested, we don't know what the results would be. But what if he's successful in the Ukraine? Will he learn to live with these sanctions, like North Korea has lived with sanctions for 70 years, Cuba has lived with sanctions for 60 years, Iran has lived with sanctions for 40 years. And can the world live with sanctions? I'm paying $6 a gallon for gas here. I'm an employed professional, so is my partner. In the United States, there are not many of those people left in here after the COVID crisis. After all of this, can the global economy take the blockade of Russian oil? Can the European economy withstand it? And how long can he hold out? I think are all sort of relevant questions to his response.
Yeah.
I just wanted to add very quickly, when talking about like if China take any lesson for the future, in fact, as the public opinion on the ground that in the countries very close to China, they are talking about the current situation, which means if all of the Western countries, the US, are so busy with the Western front, China can react like now, immediately in the Eastern front. And so when you talk about the, just a few weeks ago, when Russia sent their troops to the borders with Ukraine, like no one like we are still talking about if like whether a war won't happen. And currently, right now, China is also holding a military exercise right in on the South China Sea right now. So I mean, actually, there's discussion on the ground there if China can just turn that military exercise into a real war in any time. It's not just like in the future, like weeks or months or so. It could happen. It's a real concern, and it's not just the future concern.
Katie?
Yeah, I just wanted to come back on sanctions, and just to say, I think the strength and the unity and the resolve that we've seen, which I'll be honest is much more than I thought would be the case. I think it's just a real visceral reaction to seeing this is who Putin is and this is what he's going to do. And it's both about stopping him in Ukraine, which if he's not stopped, he has shown he's prepared to wage war on the entire country. He wants to take over Ukraine. And I think if he's not stopped there are real questions about how far he will go. There's a lot of talk about he has his eye on northern parts of Kazakhstan with a high population of Russian speakers. So I think sanctions are a very imperfect, very imprecise, and very painful tool for the populations that are going to suffer under them. But I think to Adam's point, it's sort of the least worst option. What else do you do if you're not prepared to respond militarily? How else do you respond? And I think one possible, it's not an off-ramp for Putin, but I'm sure one of the thoughts behind sanctions is to change the minds of people around him and to hope that there are more sensible heads that can prevail in the Kremlin who decide that this guy's wrecking our legacy, wrecking our wealth, wrecking our children's future. And we should, I think the greatest danger to Putin now is not the popular response. It's within the Kremlin and whether people decide he's gone too far. Because this was his whole, there was the building a great, glorious, victorious nation that was part of his pitch, but there was also the not being the 1990s. There was the idea that he was the guy who restored stability, who meant pensions and wages got paid on time, who, the financial crisis of the 1990s was what he was always compared to and what people would say, like, at least he's better than the alternative and the chaos that came before. So I think totally tanking the Russian economy, I don't want to underestimate the impact that's going to have on real people's lives. But I presume part of the thinking here is to undermine his legitimacy and try to encourage somebody within the Kremlin to take action against him, which I'm sure he knows and will be extremely paranoid and careful to ensure that can't happen.
Do we have any question here from the audience? We're getting close to the end of our time. Any question? Yeah, hold on. Yeah.
What type of off ramps can be made available to Putin by Western countries? Is that even an option that Western countries can come together and say we can allow for this to happen so that we don't have to escalate any further?
Yeah, what is a kind of off ramp? And also, because Felix brought up the Cuban Missile Crisis, sometimes analogies are useful because of similarities, but sometimes they're just very useful because they show how different something is. And it seems that in the Cuban Missile Crisis, as intense as it was, people had a good sense of what the other side's calculations might be. And that seems to be what we keep coming back to, having very little sense of with this. But anybody want to suggest an off-ramp? Please?
I think the problem with all of this too is Ukraine has a vote. Ukraine has agency. It's Ukraine that's under attack, and the terms that Russia is laying down now are wholly unacceptable to Ukraine. So, unless Ukrainians are prepared to accept partitioning their country, losing control over large parts of it, it's very difficult to see an off ramp that doesn't just totally withdraw agency from Ukraine and Ukrainians. And I think a lot of what could have been done has been done in terms of, offering to have very high level discussions, offering to, let's talk about the security architecture of Europe. There are off ramps there if Putin wants them. I think the problem is there's no evidence right now that Putin's particularly interested in taking them.
Yeah, but an unacceptable off ramp is that we stop supporting, supplying, and funding the Ukrainian opposition. Ukraine falls to the Russians, and they don't have that much agency. When you lose a war, you don't have that much agency. So the question is, what are our goals in continuing the war? Really, what are our goals? Because we're kind of militarily involved, even if we're not actually boots on the ground. Sorry, Adam, go.
No, I mean, it's a good point. What are our goals? What are the Ukrainians' goals? It feels like, as Katie said, I mean, bar the dismembering of Ukraine, the recognition of the Donbass region and Crimea, handing those lock, stock, and barrel to the Russians, giving Putin something that, lifting sanctions, giving Putin something that and in return there is a Russian drawdown and a recognition of Ukraine's sovereign borders outside that. Heaven knows what happens to guarantees of, Ukraine's future with the EU or NATO or anything. Yes, as Katie says, totally withdrawing agency from Ukrainians. Really hard to know. I would say one thing, just thinking about it again from a very Washington perspective, is that American intelligence on this, for once, has absolutely knocked it out of the park. The Americans have known for months what was going on inside Russia's war plans. They told the Chinese back in November that Putin had already made up his mind to attack. On the basis of like one or two conversations I've had in Washington with people who kind of know whereof they speak, they said that they had never seen intelligence of this quality being used and turned into product and handed around Washington, that it was extremely granular and very, very high quality. So one must assume that the Americans are going to know. I think it's a reasonable assumption the Americans are probably going to know quite a bit about Putin's intentions and the intentions of others inside the Russian establishment, and crucially inside the Russian military from here on in. Whether they telegraph that stuff in the same way they've been telegraphing intelligence in the run-up to the invasion, who knows? But the idea that we're probably totally in the dark about what the Russians are thinking and what's being said and thought inside the establishment on the basis of what we've already seen, I'd say probably the Americans are going to have quite a good idea of what's being talked about. Just a thought. I mean, who knows, but just a thought.
So thank you all. This has been incredibly wide-ranging and just what I think we hoped it would be, except for giving us more optimism about going forward. That would have been nice to find, but too much to ask. But thank you all for your time, and thanks.
Thank you very much, Jeff.
Thanks for convening this, Jeff. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.